Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Megan Hurlbert, Associate Director in Exhibitions here at the Art Institute of Chicago. I started working on Gustave Caillebotte, Painting His World, in 2022 with tonight's speaker, and it has been a joy to see the exhibition come to life in Chicago. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the museum and to tonight's program, Gustave Caillebotte, Artist as Collector. This landmark exhibition reintroduces Gustave Caillebotte as a singular voice within Impressionism, an artist who turned his gaze inward, capturing the intimate world of his family, friends, and everyday encounters. This program is generously sponsored by the Mary Soleiman Lecture Fund. I am happy to say that Mary Soleiman is in the audience this evening, and we are so grateful. We are so grateful for her ongoing support of the museum. It is now my pleasure to introduce Megan True, who will present on Caillebotte's expansive Impressionist collection, the impact that it had on his work, and the scandal that followed its donation. Megan is the curatorial assistant in the Department of Painting and Sculpture of Europe. She earned degrees from Butler University and George Washington University, where she specialized in 19th century French art. She has previously held positions at the Indianapolis Museum of Art in Newfields, the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, and the Dallas Museum of Art. Megan will be starting a graduate program in the fall at the Courtauld Institute in London, England. We're grateful to recognize the John D. and Alexandra C. Nichols Family Foundation for their lead support of Gustave Caillebotte Painting His World. Raymond James is the lead corporate sponsor. We thank them for their generous support. Now, please join me in welcoming Megan to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me here tonight. Gustave Caillebotte wrote his first will in 1876 when he was only 28 years old. His younger brother, René, had just died suddenly at only 26 years old, and this was only 2 years after the death of their father. And both of these losses deeply impacted Caillebotte. At such a young age, he was already thinking about his legacy and what he'd like to leave behind when he was gone. He had only begun exhibiting with the Impressionists earlier that year, but he was already deeply invested in the success of the movement. He set aside a certain amount of money to hold another Impressionist exhibition after he was gone and specified that he would like Edgar Degas, Claude Monet, Camille Pissarro, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Paul Cézanne, Alfred Sisley, and Berthe Morisot to be included specifically. Others could join, but he specifically wanted those. And in addition to these funds for a future Impressionist exhibition, Caillebotte also stated that his collection of Impressionist art be donated to the French state at the time of his death, writing, "I give to the state the paintings that I own only as I want the gift to be accepted and to be accepted in such a way that these paintings do not go to an attic or a provincial museum, but to the Luxembourg and later to the Louvre. It is necessary that a certain time elapses before the execution of this clause, until the public, I do not say understands, but rather accepts them. This time can be 20 years or more. In the meantime, my brother Martial, and failing him, another of my heirs will keep them. I ask Renoir to be my executor and to accept a painting that he chooses. My heirs will insist that he take an important one." The verbiage in his will is evidence that Caillebotte was not only thinking about his own legacy, but the legacy of Impressionism as a whole. He knew that Impressionism should be included in the canon of French art and knew that it belonged not in an attic or a tiny little country museum where they could kind of place it and hide it out of sight, but in the Louvre, the country's most prominent museum. To Caillebotte, his identity as a collector was equally as important to his identity as an artist, and we are able to see just how integral his collecting was to his sense of self in his 1879 painting, Self-Portrait at the Easel. This is the only self-portrait of Caillebotte that he made depicting himself at work. But while he shows himself in the act of painting something, he has his canvas angled away from us, the viewer, so we can't see what he's working on. Instead, the focus is shifted to the large canvas behind him, which is very identifiable as Pierre-Auguste Renoir's Ball at the Moulin de la Galette. And this painting obviously took pride of place in his home. He even enlarged the frame a little bit from what it actually was to really emphasize how important it was to him. If you look closely, you can see the frames of several other works that are just a little bit too indistinct to be identifiable, but we know that his collection was incredibly important to him and something that he kept very close to him. And Caillebotte began his collection actually before he even began exhibiting with the Impressionists. So he began studying art around 1873, and it was in 1875 that he began collecting, a year before he would start exhibiting with the Impressionists. And he started collecting in a little bit more of a traditional manner. He started with works on paper, which were a little bit more accessible to beginning collectors. And so he owned one work on paper, this drawing by Paul Gavarni, and two drawings by Jean-François Millet. Both of these artists were kind of more in the realist vein. Their work was a little bit more acceptable at the time. And as I go through and kind of do a breakdown of the contents of his collection, you'll see that there are some that have this green highlight around them and some that don't. Those that are highlighted in green are works that were accepted by the French state after his death. As was alluded to earlier, there was a bit of controversy when this donation was made, and only some of them ended up making their way into the official French state collections. The next artist that he turned his attention to was Edouard Manet, who was an incredible influence on each of the Impressionist artists. They considered him a precursor to the Impressionist movement, and a lot of them, including Caillebotte and Degas, were always trying to convince Manet to exhibit with them, and Manet was never quite convinced that that was the right fit for him. But all the same, Caillebotte greatly admired him as an artist and would eventually own 4 of his works, 2 of which he purchased from Manet's posthumous studio sale after his death in early 1884. Now, another artist whose style was quite different from Caillebotte's, but he still viewed Cézanne as a very important innovator within the Impressionist movement. He would own 5 paintings by Cézanne. These in particular were quite controversial when they were donated to the state. The vase of flowers there in the middle that's now in the National Gallery of Art was actually immediately struck from the list by the French state. They were like, absolutely not. This is not quite our style. And of course, now it is in one of the best museums in the country, so I'm sure they regret that move. And of course, we have 8 pastels by Edgar Degas. Now, Caillebotte and Degas famously did not get along very well. They both had very different ideas of what they would like the Impressionist exhibitions to look like and what they would like the legacy of Impressionism to be. Caillebotte often wrote in his letters that he really admired Degas as an artist, but gosh, that guy is just not a good person. All the same, he owned quite a few Degas pastels, and at the time of his death, Degas' star was actually rising, and the museum wanted all of them. And the one in the far right over here, the dance lesson, which is now at the Met, is actually the work that Renoir chose for himself as the executor of Caillebotte's will. And so he ended up with that pastel, and it is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And of course, he and Renoir were quite close. He was the godfather of Renoir's first child. And a big motivation for him as he was collecting was supporting his friends. He was born into independent wealth. He never had to sell his own work. He never had to market his own work. But he was in quite a different position than the other Impressionists, and he was very aware of that. Renoir, Monet, and Pissarro in particular were struggling quite a bit throughout different portions of their career. And so as they would hit a rough spot, Caillebotte would often offer to purchase a work, but he was quite selective on what works he would purchase when. In one instance with Renoir, his study of a female torso in sunlight there was actually included in one of the Impressionist exhibitions and was a favorite to hate by the critics. They absolutely loathed it. It got the most negative reviews out of any painting in the exhibition, and Caillebotte said, "I will take that one." And now it's in the Musée d'Orsay, so ultimately it worked out. And Alfred Sisley, who is now kind of a lesser-known Impressionist, not quite on the same level as Degas, Monet, but Caillebotte really saw him as an essential member of the Impressionist group. He always made sure to mention him and include him when they were planning the exhibitions, and their interests were actually quite similar. You'll see a lot of the paintings that he owned of Sisley's were of the Seine River and sailing on the Seine River, which of course were two of Caillebotte's great passions. And of course, he was very, very close with Claude Monet. He would not only purchase Monet's paintings directly from him for significantly more than they were worth at the time, he would also assist him by paying the rent for studios and apartments as he was trying to just stay afloat in Paris and continue to practice his art. And it's kind of amazing to think of, we may not have as much Monet work as we do if not for Caillebotte supporting him. And of course, a lot of these are now famous works. We have one that's quite similar to some of his series of the Gare Saint-Lazare. We have one of those series that Caillebotte really encouraged him to paint. And then finally, we have Pissarro. He actually ended up owning more Pissarros than any other artist. I think he was really taken by Pissarro's landscapes. I think something that really spoke to Caillebotte as well is Pissarro was quite localized in his painting as well. Once he moved out to Pontoise, he really painted his home, and I think that resonated with Caillebotte, who, if you've seen the exhibition, also stayed very close to his home. And with Pissarro, it's also quite interesting. He collected his first and only kind of more decorative piece with this fan here, which unfortunately was not accepted into his bequest and ended up in a private collection. And although a lot of Caillebotte's paintings from the late 1870s through the 1880s are set in the Boulevard Haussmann apartment that he shared with his younger brother Martial, he really only gives hints at his collection aside from Self-Portrait at the Easel. You can see here that there is a hint of a frame up here in the corner. There are a couple of other portraits where you can just see the bottom of a frame peeking through, maybe a hint of a painting. But they really were very important to him. And interestingly, one of the best records that we have of his collection at the time he was alive is through his younger brother, Martial. Martial married in 1887 and moved out of their home on the Boulevard Haussmann into a nearby apartment on the Rue Scribe. And he became an amateur photographer in the early 1890s. We have a lot of pictures from him in 1891 and 1892. And these are pictures of the interior of his apartment. And what we can see from this is he not only had works by his brother Caillebotte, we can see here this portrait of their mother in his home, but he also shared his personal collection of Impressionist art with his brother. And we can see also in that room is Sisley's Brickyard Path. And it's quite interesting to kind of go through and see how anything in purple is work by Caillebotte, anything in red is work from his collection of Impressionists, and how it was really personal to the entire family. He was willing to share this and make sure that everyone had access to this art, and that was a huge part of his ethos, was being able to share the art of this movement that he was so passionate about. And so in here, in Martial's sitting room, we see a painting by Caillebotte of the seashore in Normandy, and then also Degas' ballet. And this, which we think is maybe the entrance to his apartment, you see a little corner of Monet's Regatta at Argenteuil. And this here is a picture of his study. And in the corner there, you see a little bit of the dance lesson. And going back, unfortunately, maddeningly, not all of these are identifiable. I looked, and I looked, and I looked for this painting here, and could not find anything that matched up just right. So there are a couple mysteries throughout here, and maybe Martial had his own collection that we don't have record of, but there are a couple outliers in there. And then here is Martial's playing the piano. He was a composer. You see Millet's Peasant Returning with Manure, very romantic painting, drawing there. And then, of course, Gustave did keep some of the paintings with him. So this is his kind of studio/workshop in his country home at Petite Gennevilliers, which he moved to full-time after his younger brother married in 1887. And you see him here, he's working on a boat design. That was one of his passions at the end of his life, but you can still see how important art and painting was to him. And he's got one of his own paintings on an easel in the background here. But in the background, we can also identify Monet's Snow Effect at Vétoil and Degas' seated dancer massaging her left foot in the background there. And then this is a lovely little photo of one of his friends relaxing at his home. You can see he displays these a bit haphazardly in his own home compared to his brother. If we go back to this as well, you can see canvases stacked up in the background here. We don't know if those are his own works, canvases that he's waiting to paint, or just other works that he hasn't hung yet. But even inside here, you can see a canvas laid up against the wall, which is quite interesting that he was a bit haphazard with those. But above the door there, we can see Manet's Lady at her window. And I absolutely love that we can tell that it is in the same frame still as it is at the Musée d'Orsay. And then curiously hung unframed is Monet's apartment interior. And then below that is Pissarro's Côte Saint-Denis at Pontoise. So this is the entire Caillebotte collection. He, at the time of his death on February 12th in 1894, he was only 45 years old, and he owned 72 works of art in his Impressionist collection. And in March of that year, just about a month after his passing, Renoir took control as the executor of his will and informed Henri Rougon, who was the director of the École des Beaux-Arts, of Caillebotte's bequest to the state. And later that month, the Consultative Committee of National Museums, which included curators and directors from all of the state museums in France, so at the time it would have been the Louvre, the Musée de Luxembourg, and the École des Beaux-Arts, They met to evaluate the collection and take a vote on the acceptance of the gift. So even in this meeting, as we are just starting out, there are some inconsistencies with the numbers. So in the minutes of this meeting, only 60 of the 72 works are mentioned. Of course, one of those works was already taken by Renoir. And there were a couple that they kind of dug up, as we discussed earlier. He was a little bit haphazard with his organizing. So they were able to kind of find a couple of others later on as they were negotiating the acceptance of this gift. But by the end of this meeting, 59 of these 60 works were accepted by the committee. And of course, that one that got knocked off was the Cézanne vase of flowers that they hated right off the bat. So although they were accepted, there were still some term negotiation to do, and so it wasn't until April of 1894 that Martial and Renoir were informed that the bequest was accepted, but at that time they were also warned that all of the works, with the exception of the 2 Millet drawings, would go to the Musée de Luxembourg, which at the time was the Museum for Living Artists. In order to be displayed in the Louvre, an artist had to be dead for at least 20 years. And at the time, Millet was the only one that fit that bill. Manet had not been dead quite long enough, or they may have taken him, but the rest of them were still alive, so it was a no-go. But the Musée de Luxembourg, because it was the Museum of Living Artists, was quite crowded, as you can imagine. A lot of artists wanted their work in there, and it was quite difficult to find the space for such a large gift. And so they were warned that they probably wouldn't be able to display all of them, especially at the same time it would be broken up. And of course, Martial and Renoir were not happy about this. They did not think that, although technically it may have followed the letter of Caillebotte's will, it was not aligned with the spirit of his will. They wanted his collection to be seen in its entirety. And so negotiations continued. At this time, obviously, Impressionism was still not accepted by the broader public. It was still considered quite a radical movement, and that complicated the negotiations a bit. There were people involved that did not think that these paintings were worthy of coming into the museums, especially as a full collection to be displayed together. And so it took another year, but in January of 1895, a compromise was finally reached, stating that the French state would be able to acquire the works of its choosing from the collection, and the heirs of Caillebotte would retain the remainder that they did not choose. And so at the time, the curator of the Musée du Luxembourg was Léonce Benedict, and he was charged with selecting the works, and he was actually quite progressive for the time and worked directly with Martial and Renoir, as well as the artists that were represented in the gift, to kind of see which ones they would like to prioritize making it into the museum, which was actually quite nice at the time, that they were able to kind of have a say into which of their works they thought would best represent them in the State Museum. And so eventually, 40 of the 72 works were acquired by the French state. So the 2 Millet drawings did go to the Louvre, but the Luxembourg ended up acquiring 2 Manet paintings, 2 Cézanne paintings, 6 Renoir paintings, 6 Sisley paintings, 7 Pissarro paintings, 7 Degas pastels, and 8 Monet paintings. And in the end, most of the artists were quite happy with this compromise. They were happy that they got a little bit of a say in what was actually going up on the walls. This, of course, did not include Degas, who was quite upset that his works were going into a national museum at all. He did not think that his work should be easily accessed by the public. So that was a whole nother thing, but it was thanks to Caillebotte that Degas' works were accessible to the public. But notably, Caillebotte did not include any of his own work in his gift. Martial and Renoir, once all of these complicated negotiations were done, decided that that really wasn't right and that he needed to be represented. And so they went through his body of work and selected Floor Scrapers, which of course was one of Caillebotte's most prized paintings. It was the first and only painting that he ever attempted to submit to the Salon, and then was quite celebrated at the Impressionist exhibitions, as well as View of Rooftops, to go into the French state's collection, so that he would be represented as an artist and not only a collector. Of course, his collection did overshadow his art for quite some time, but due to them, he was represented, and that was incredibly important to them at the time. So the decree authorizing the National Museums to accept this bequest was signed by the French president in February of 1896. So now 2 years have passed, and it's finally coming to be. But space was still an issue. And so this early 20th century painting here, which is dated between 1903 and 1910, kind of shows this main line of galleries at the Luxembourg, and you can see how crowded they were. It was hung salon style. Everything was just absolutely packed in there. And so they decided that in order to really show the Caillebotte collection and the few other works of Impressionism that they did have at the time, they needed to kind of construct its own gallery. And so they added on a new wing to the museum, and eventually the Caillebotte collection ended up in its own gallery here in Gallery G. And it wasn't until February 9th of 1897 that the Salle Caillebotte finally opened to the public. And at the time, there was really nowhere else in the world that you could see such a robust collection of Impressionist artists all in one place. And although it was quite controversial at the time, it drew very large crowds. And of course, as you can imagine, there were some very mixed reactions. Some absolutely loved it. There were a lot of proponents of Impressionism that would come often to see it. And of course, there were others that merely sensationalized it. And there are some very funny reports in newspapers at the time of people entering the room and just screaming, women fainting. It was just too much for them to take all of that in one space. And interestingly enough, also, shortly after the Salle Caillebotte finally opened, members of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, which included Caillebotte's former teacher, Léon Bonnat, wrote a letter to the Minister of Fine Arts objecting to the display of the collection, calling them defective works, unworthy of such hospitality, and trying to compel them to remove them at the very least, if not expel them from the collection altogether. Of course, they were thankfully unsuccessful. But in the early 20th century, Martial did come back to the National Museums and try to convince them to accept the remainder of the collection. They refused. They had taken all they were willing to take at the time, and because of the mixed reactions, weren't willing to take the risk of adding more to it. This led to a lot of bad blood between the state and the family, and Martial decided that that's it. We will no longer have a relationship with the National Museums. And so the remainder of the collection did not go to them even when they probably wanted it a couple decades later. And so after Martial's death in 1910, his family slowly started to sell off the remaining works. Some of them, as we saw earlier, did end up in prominent museums like the National Gallery of Art, like the Barnes Collection in Philadelphia. but a lot of them did end up in private collections, which is just a shame. And starting in 1929, which was 35 years after Caillebotte's death and his explicit wishes that they be in Louvre, the works of the Caillebotte collection and many other paintings from their Impressionist works were slowly transferred from the Musée de Luxembourg to the newly completed modern painting galleries in the Louvre. Few photos of these galleries exist from this time, but we can still identify works from Caillebotte's collection that took precedence in these galleries. And so everything in red here, we have very prominent examples of Caillebotte's collection. And then up here in purple, we have floor scrapers. And Degas, of course, had his own gallery. Finally befitting the master. And so finally, in 1986, a new French state museum that was fully dedicated to modern art opened, which is the Musée d'Orsay that we know and love now. Along with other works by Impressionist and post-Impressionist artists, Caillebotte's collection was transferred to this new museum, where it remains today. In 2024, which was the 130th anniversary of Caillebotte's death and luckily corresponding with the Orsay's presentation of the Caillebotte exhibition, his collection that was accepted by the state was displayed together almost in its entirety. The Degas pastels weren't included because they were light-sensitive pastels, but always funny how he's always the outlier there. And this was the first time that they had been displayed all together like this since they were hung in the Luxembourg in 1897. And so I just think that this exhibit was such a great way to celebrate the achievements of this singular artist collector. And it really highlights his invaluable contributions to the legacy of Impressionism. Thank you. And I do believe we have some time for questions now. If anyone has questions, they can raise their hand, and a staff member from the Art Institute will bring a microphone down to you.
Coming down to the front.
Has anyone placed the value, a fair market value, of all of his collection?
Of all of it?
Yes.
I haven't seen it all compiled in one place. That would be a really interesting look, though. I did attempt as I was going through, because we do have numbers for what he paid for some of these. Like he paid about 300 francs a piece for Monet's paintings. I really tried to do the math to see what that would be today, and it was a little too complicated. But I would be really interested to see what they're worth today, because as we know, Caillebotte's work has kind of increased in value, and the other Impressionist artists even more so. So I'm sure it would be worth a pretty penny today.
And has any other artist had such an extensive Impressionist collection while they were still alive? Because they weren't really that valued or considered important.
They weren't. No, it's actually quite interesting. Hate to bring him back into it, but Degas also was a collector. They came head-to-head quite a bit. He had a very different collecting philosophy from Caillebotte. He was much more interested in depicting French modernism writ broad, but he also collected Impressionist artists. With the other Impressionists, Caillebotte was unique in that he was independently wealthy, so he could afford to purchase these works. With the other Impressionists, it was actually quite common for them to trade work for one another. So each of the artists did have some sort of collection of each other's work, but it was mostly done through kind of horse trading so that they could get what they liked and still kind of circulate their work around.
I'm just wondering how Rainy Day made its way, all right? What was the trajectory of, where did that painting move around, and how did it end up here?
Of Paris Street Rainy Day, sorry.
Yes, our
I'm
Paris
trying to
Street.
locate it. Oh, yes, of course.
All right, a rainy day.
So Paris Street Rainy Day did remain with the Caillebotte family for quite a while. We actually had some of their descendants out here recently, the descendants of Martial, Caillebotte's youngest brother. And he said that at some point, because it was so large, no one knew what to do with it. And it was just leaning face in against like a set of stairs. They truly didn't know what to do with this gigantic painting. It changed hands privately a couple of times. It came to America when it entered the Chrysler collection in the early 20th century. And then we purchased it through Chrysler in 1964. And I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but we got it for absolute pennies compared to what it's worth today. At the time, in the 60s, I mean, Caillebotte wasn't a household name. He hadn't really been reintroduced into the canon until the 70s, and so we were quite early on that trend. And now, of course, we have his masterpiece, so it worked out for us quite well.
There's a question back here.
I've been coming to the museum here for many, many years, and it's my favorite painting of all time. I can never stop looking at it. But I know that there is some issue about information about his private life, specifically about the fact that he painted a lot of gentlemen, but there is some information that he had some kind of a lifelong companion. Can you speak to that at all?
Of course, yeah. So we don't have a ton of records of his personal life. There aren't many surviving letters. We do know, just from the way that he was raised and his interests in life, that he moved through a very homosocial world. He had 3 brothers. As he was growing up, he did a stint in the military that was quite formative for him. He was interested in rowing and sporting and sailing, and so of course this led to him having quite close circles of men around him at all times. Brotherhood and connection was incredibly important to him. He did socialize with women occasionally. We do know through wives, partners of other friends, and he did have a companion for at least the last decade of his life. Her name was Charlotte Berthier. We know that she lived with him in Petite Gennevilliers. She is listed on several censuses as an amie, just a friend. They never married, they never had children. So we can't say for sure what the nature of their relationship was. What we do know is that Martial's family that he married into did not approve of her. We don't have much information on her, again, but we think that she was an actress. She was quite a bit younger than Caillebotte, at least a decade. And it's thought that after his death, they went through and removed a lot of evidence of her from the record. It's crazy that she lived with him for about 10 years and she's never mentioned in any letters. If you go through the exhibition in the final gallery, there are 2 small photographs of Caillebotte sitting on a bench with a little dog in his lap. We know that that dog belonged to Charlotte. In all of the paintings we see of her, she's always with that little dog. And in one of them, you see next to him is a woman's hat. But if you look to the left of him, the bench slats don't quite line up. And we think that she was retro photoshopped right out of there. And so we don't have much evidence, but we do know that they were very close. He left her an allowance and a small home in his will, so they were close. But beyond that, we can't really say what the exact nature of their relationship was.
What is the incentive for various museums or collectors to constantly be contributing their works to these fantastic shows all over the world?
Yeah, so I know particularly with the Chardot family, who are the descendants of Martial Caillebotte, they are really invested in trying to advance the legacy of Caillebotte, and they want him to continue to become a recognized name in the canon and be recognized for more than just his donation, for his contributions as an artist, which, as we've seen, were quite significant. He was a pioneer in art as well as collecting. And so a lot of it is kind of just making sure that these works are seen and contribute to the themes of the show. Not everyone wants to lend. Of course, there were things that we asked for that we didn't get. So it is always a balance, but we find that quite a few collectors are very attached to the artists that they collect. And Caillebotte was the same way. He would often lend the works that were in his collection to shows. A lot of the works that were in the Impressionist exhibitions actually belonged to him, and he would choose them and say, I think that we need to show this one. He would lend his works to the exhibitions that Durand Ruel would put on, both in Europe and in New York as well. And so he was actively trying to get their names out there and increase their popularity and, in turn, their prices so that they could continue to make art.
Just talking more broadly for a moment, beyond this collection, many museums have their crown jewels, world-famous paintings that are always in demand for various exhibits.
Yes.
What is their incentive to take these crown jewels, because they could be on the market traveling continuously?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's a lot of horse trading. Us, for example, as we were going through and making the checklist for the Caillebotte exhibition here, there were a couple of works that we requested, in particular, 2 of the nudes that are, of course, at the center of our show that were absolutely essential for us to get. Nude on a Couch belongs to the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And when we first approached them, they were very hesitant to lend to us, especially for all 3 venues, because ultimately it's more than a year that these works will be away. And so we offered them a trade. We said, is there anything in our collection that you're interested in? And so they have had our Toulouse-Lautrec at the Moulin Rouge for the past year. So if you're wondering where it's been, that is where it is. It will be back later this year, I promise. But with things like that, it's a lot of kind of push and pull with the collections, making sure that they have something to either hold the place of the work that's going out on loan or something else that they can highlight to still entice visitors. So it's difficult to give these works up for so long, but it's also an opportunity to bring new works into the collection. If you were here in the fall last year while Paris Street was in Paris for the Orsay's presentation of Caillebotte, we had Manet's Lady with Fans here from the Orsay. So it's a lot of trades.
We have a question way in the back.
How many total Caillebotte productions were there, and how many does the Art Institute have?
His paintings in particular, or paintings that he owned?
No, his own personal
His
paintings.
own personal paintings. So the Art Institute owns 2 Caillebotte paintings, Paris Street Rainy Day, and then we also have a still life, which is the beef tongue and sheep's head, that is quite unique. And we were quite lucky to get that. But not everyone has a Caillebotte, so we are quite lucky to have them. Again, he has kind of only in the past couple of decades really started rising in popularity. So like the Met doesn't have a Caillebotte painting somehow. So we're ahead of them on that one. But no, we obviously are very pleased to have the paintings that we do have. I don't know a total number off the top of my head. It's probably around 500 paintings. He had a relatively short career. He died at just 45 years old. So it really is a remarkable output for such a short period of time.
I was very interested in this collection because I saw a parallel with Frederick Clay Bartlett, who I understand gave he was an artist in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and collected widely Impressionist paintings with his then wife, Helen Birch Bartlett. And when she died, he gave, I believe, 27 Impressionist paintings here to the Art Institute, which, by the way, were not readily accepted, as I hear the story.
That's true.
And because his father was on the board, because his father was pretty influential, eventually his hardware store became True Value. But Frederick wanted to be an artist, and he gave all of these paintings here. And I see a tremendous parallel in their lives. But I'm curious, because I can't remember, did Bartlett give a Caillebotte to the Art Institute?
No, he did not have a Caillebotte. And again, at that time, it wasn't really uncommon for him not to have a Caillebotte and to have other Impressionist artists instead. Because, like you said, he was still working and collecting late 19th, early 20th century. And at that time, Caillebotte's work wasn't on the market. He never sold his work, so once he died, all of it remained with the family. It all went to Martial, and it stayed with them for a couple of decades before they started attempting to kind of get some interest in it and sell it or give it to museums. And so it's not uncommon that he would not have had a Caillebotte, but there are definitely parallels there. And he may have known about the Caillebotte donation at the time, and perhaps that inspired him. It was quite big news at the time. So there's definitely a parallel there.
Hi, I was wondering if he had any interest in the female artists of his time as a collector or as a just a fellow artist. When you listed the artists, obviously very male-centric, but I was thinking of like Caillebotte, who was obviously close with Degas, and was wondering about that.
No, that's actually a great question. That's something that we've thought a lot about kind of going through this. He did not end up collecting anything from either Mary Caillebotte or Barrett Morisot. And it's interesting because he really did champion them. Again, part of the reason that he and Degas butted heads so often is because they had different ideas of who should be included in the Impressionist exhibitions. And Caillebotte in particular had a very kind of narrow idea of what made an Impressionist artist. And so he had a very set group of people that he thought should be included and highlighted every time, and it should stick to those people. And he championed Barrett Morisot and Mary Caillebotte to remain in that group. So he was very supportive of them. If we go back to his will, he didn't mention Caillebotte at the time because I don't believe that they had met in 1876. But he had definitely met Barrett Morisot and mentioned her as someone that had to be included if he was going to fund another Impressionist exhibition. And so he definitely supported their careers and respected them as artists. And kind of the reason why we think that, or theorize that he didn't end up collecting them, is because pretty much everyone else that he did collect was struggling. And he used his collecting as an opportunity to help his friends and help them stay afloat as artists. Whereas Barrett Morisot and Mary Caillebotte were both married women. They had families that were supporting them, so they were never in financial need in the same way as most of the other artists were. Even Degas, who was born into wealth, his father, when he died in 1874, left him with a lot of debt. And so in the late 1870s, which is when Caillebotte acquired most of his Degas work, he needed the money. And so we think that that may be why he didn't end up with any of the women Impressionists in his collection, but it's clear that he did respect them as artists, so it's definitely a bit of a head scratcher. Okay, well, thank you all so much.